and talk about his experience with transdisciplinarity in targeted care. And because this is the last session of professional development, we would end with an example on suffering.
Yes, right, right. Yeah, we're going to talk about suffering
Yeah,
until about 3:30. Right?
Yeah. So, can you read this?
No.
No. Okay. Um, so these are the different ways how a university curriculum or a curriculum within a subject can be organized. They can be discipline-based, they can be parallel disciplines, they can be multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary. I took this image, as all following images until Don's come, from a website on integrating the curriculum. And I actually thought they were rather interesting in their work. So they described the parallel disciplines design model, which is a rather common model in schools and colleges, where you have your different disciplines and you learn, and somehow they're connected. You know, you can see that slight line that there's a connection there, but we leave it completely to the student to make that connection or to find it. And we leave them implicit, and I think that is a big problem with it. Then we have the multidisciplinary model, where we have those different disciplines, and we already say there might be a common theme. We might even talk about the common theme. And actually, professors might refer to something students might do in another a subject.
Right. People come together and say, "Oh, wow, you use the scientific method too."
Yes,
right.
that can happen. What I find interesting is they describe this here. They base this on research they have found, Park and Son, and they should say that in the multidisciplinary model, the student still stays a consumer of knowledge, and the teacher is a facilitator of knowledge. And I like that because it goes on, and I always, through other models. Then there's the interdisciplinary design model, where we have an explicit reference of one discipline to the other. And in this model, we have a common goal, and we really use from the different disciplines to get to that goal. And here the student becomes a collaborator of knowledge, while the teacher becomes the designer of the learning environment. So we see how the student's role, if we look at it this way, the student's role becomes more and more active. And in the third model, the transdisciplinary model that we actually want to talk about mostly today, you see that there's different things now that are different from the interdisciplinary model. And now we should have one of those pointy.
Right. Oh, we do have a pointer.
There
we go.
Look at that.
Yeah, there you go.
Point. Yeah, we might have a pointy thingy, but it doesn't point anywhere.
Doesn't.
I can't do it.
No.
Okay, I can't do it.
Here, I'll work on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't reach.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Maybe if I go closer.
Yeah, there you go. No, screen's too bright.
Right. Okay, so what's important here is that we have the disciplines on one side, but we don't only have the disciplines. We have non-academic skills on the other side. And yesterday I said I can only use this because Don is not here. Now he is here. But I'm still going to say it. Let's see if, the theater explodes. There's a real life problem.
Oh, right. Real life I don't mind. It's real world that bothers me. That's okay.
Okay. So it's based on, a real life problem that wants to be solved, that is just, or maybe it doesn't even tackle, because very often these are problems you can't solve. It's another thing. We always talk about problem solving. And we can only talk about things that we can actually solve. But a real life issue, and we will ask you later to come up with some real life issues, and then talk about how knowledge from outside the discipline, from outside of academia, being very central for this kind of process. And John will talk about that in his example from palliative care, that suddenly people are almost driving the process that usually are never heard. So what they say here, it's not me. Use the microphone. Oh, they're streaming? Okay, okay. Oh yeah, they're streaming it. Okay, so, this is weird. So, we have a common goal setting, as we said before, and the model is based on collaboration. And as a result of this, the role of student and teacher shift, and I quote, "In this design model, the student is the producer of knowledge, while the teacher is the designer of the interactive learning environment." And if we can achieve that, we can already, everybody in the room here knows that the students will take so much more out of the learning experience if they see themselves as the producer of the knowledge and they're not just the consumer of the knowledge. And I think that's the important shift that we would try to make from when we are going from a discipline-based model to this transdisciplinary-based model in general education. I'm not saying the entire university is supposed to change everything they're doing. I'm just saying, or advocating, that this is a very good ideal model to use for general education. So the kinds of questions that transdisciplinarity usually tackles have become known as wicked questions, and we like that term a lot, and we thought we'd go to Wikipedia and get the definition. A wicked problem, okay, wicked questions or wicked problems. A wicked problem is a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. So first part of the job is even to recognize what are the paradigms that are difficult here, what are the requirements. So to tackle a wicked problem as a class really has to start very early with the definition of what is actually the problem. And talking about definition, I left that here because the second sentence is so beautiful. The use of the term wicked here has come to denote resistance to resolution rather than evil. So a wicked problem is not an evil problem, it is just a problem that doesn't want to be solved. And those stand at the center of transdisciplinary research, and I think as everybody who's older than 15 knows, they stand at the center of life. And that's why it's probably a life skill. So, now, Don.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a sort of aspect of my own professional experience that led me to be interested in this approach, this transdisciplinary approach. And I think it might be a useful metaphor in a way for what we might do in creating transdisciplinary courses. And the idea behind these courses, as Karen said, would not be in any way to replace the courses that we have in our disciplines, or in any way to minimize the importance of our disciplines. I mean, I think we all, have devoted our lives to different disciplines because it's where our passions are expressed, and they're deeply important to us, and there's strong allegiances there. So it's really not in any way meant to alter those kinds of commitments. It's really about whether there's some things we could do from the standpoint of human interaction and responding to the complexities of life, and that would make for interesting courses and that would have practical value. So I kind of want to share with you this example. So I'm a palliative care psychologist, so most of the work that I do a lot of different things in psychology, but most of the work that I do focuses on people with advanced illness and on concerns that are associated with end of life. And one kind of revolutionary finding, and what's weird is that it's only revolutionary in an academic setting. It's not revolutionary to anybody in what Karen calls the real world. It's not revolutionary to people who are experiencing illness, but it surprised many people in the field of palliative care, was that this woman, Karen Steinhauser, who's a nurse, she works in the discipline of nursing, and she works collaboratively with other providers. She did a study about what mattered most to patients who were receiving palliative care and what their physicians thought mattered most. And it turned out that there was a lot of disagreement between the patients and the physicians. So what she found is that only 65% of physicians thought that patients would value being mentally aware at end of life, whereas 92% of the patients thought that was an important thing to have happen. Being at peace with God was important to 89% of the patients. Only 65% of the physicians thought that that was important. Not being a burden to families was a very high concern for patients. Physicians were not thinking that that was very important to people, or not many physicians were thinking that that was important. One thing that I found in my own work is that most people who are faced with serious illness would like very much to be helpful to others. And that is a high, it's only 88% here, and that's still quite high. But in my own clinical experience, I would say it's closer to 99%. And interestingly, only 44% of physicians thought that that was important. So, and this goes on, that there's this discrepancy. Now that doesn't mean in any way that the physicians that are providing care in this circumstance are not doing their jobs well. They may be doing their jobs, extraordinarily well, and it's still that the disciplinary perspective is not adequate to the problem. So what is the problem? Well, this is sort of just a schematic of the problem, but you can see, that there are many, many things that contribute to suffering for people with advanced illness. So there's psychological distress, there's tremendous uncertainty, there's uncertainty about a variety of things, from treatment efficacy to whether symptom relief will be obtained. There's pain and other physical symptoms, there's spiritual distress, there are major social role changes, including inability to do things that one has done often for decades. And then there are also a variety of different cultural beliefs around illness that lead people to experience stigma and other kinds of social suffering. So there's this whole realm of distress. And in order to be effective with a person in that condition, you really need a group of different professionals with different disciplines. So you need medicine, you need nursing, you need pharmacy, you need social work, you need chaplaincy, and you need psychology in order to address all of these complex kinds of issues. And then the question becomes, well, so how do they work together? How would this happen? And there's really, in the history of this field, there are three approaches, and it's very similar to what Karen has just covered. So there's the multidisciplinary team approach, and what happens in that case is that all of the professions provide what they provide to the patient, and it's really up to the patient to figure out how it all fits together. And one of the dangers with this, if you've ever been in this kind of situation or have had a loved one in this situation, is that the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing, and people end up with a variety of different kinds of solutions to the same problem from different providers. And this is what, in the work that I do, often leads to a person coming to me who has 27 different prescriptions. And that is okay in the midst of all of the illness, distress, and everything else. Trying to figure out how to take 27 different medications a day can be quite challenging, and often not very satisfactory from a symptom reduction and side effect point of view either. So it's hard to collaborate effectively in this model. So then the interdisciplinary team arose, and the good thing about that was that the providers weren't just talking through the medical record, they were actually talking to one another. And the downside of this is that there's no discipline here that is specific to this problem. So it ends up, the way this works is it ends up being a lot of, what do you think? What does your discipline say about this? What do you think? What should we do about, the psychiatric distress that this person appears to be displaying? Okay, well, why don't we call the psychologist? We'll see what the psychologist thinks. Well, why don't we call, let's call the advanced practice nurse and see what she thinks. And it's not that it doesn't work, it's that it's got a little bit of incoherence associated with it. And the other thing is that because this approach is not structured, it usually defaults to one discipline to serve as the leader, and that's typically determined by the environment, and in most cases in healthcare it ends up being medicine. And that means that you might not get all of the information from the other disciplines. So what evolved out of this instead was a transdisciplinary approach. And the transdisciplinary idea is that there's a palliative care team. Everyone on the team practices the discipline of palliative care. And granted, not everyone on the team can do everything that every other person can do, but every person has the same lens and the capacity to know when particular licensed professional services are needed. And so decision-making can be done in this problem-focused way that allows for the maximum of patient input. And the patient in this model can drive the care. And so this really is a problem-centered way of using multiple disciplines. And we could imagine that there are all kinds of these, right? I mean, this is just one. This is one from my own professional experience. But we could imagine that there are all kinds of these. One analogy that I use, and Karen has some other analogies that she'll share with you, but one analogy that I use for this is, you need, for a particular kind of problem, it's as though you need your own mini discipline. And many of you, I'm sure, are aware of this, but psychology, the field that I'm in, psychology, in around the 1870s, just sort of split off from philosophy. And it split off in a way that, was sort of abrupt and required a kind of reestablishment of the identity of or a new establishment of the identity of the field, and in many ways forced philosophy to regroup. It kind of threw a structural change into philosophy. One of the things that has happened in the field of psychology ever since has been this, like, almost, you might say it's kind of ironic that it happens in psychology, but it's been a consistent effort to deny one's parent, right? It's like, okay, we're not from philosophy. No, we're a science and we're not from philosophy. And so what happens when these things kind of take place is that in the history of disciplines, there's been this sense that, okay, we need a new discipline and we're going to throw out the old one. And there's going to be this rift and we're not going to try to associate ourselves with that old discipline anymore. And we don't want to be subsumed by that old discipline anymore. And I think that transdisciplinarity is our opportunity to do this differently. Instead of splintering off, we can create new disciplines that tie back to our disciplines. So we find a problem, we create new methods and disciplines that synthesize those from other methods and disciplines, and then we feed that back into the disciplines we're from. So ideally, in this palliative care work that I do, I want to feed back all the things that I learned from addressing palliative care into psychology more broadly. And just to give you an example, so one of the ways that I'm trying to do this now, and I've found it to be kind of remarkably effective, is that I'm using a lot of palliative care concepts, including these things that people say are useful at end of life. I'm using these as key points of inquiry for treatment for supervising students who are treating people who have psychological distress who are not ill. They don't have illness. So people who are coming to us with social anxiety or panic or other kinds of problems, and we're using these very things, and it is remarkably effective to do so. Some of you may have heard of Stephen Levine. Stephen Levine wrote a wonderful book called Who Dies? And he always says, and I think it's a useful thing to think about, and it's helpful to almost anyone, is if you found out that you had just a few minutes left to live, or I'm sorry, I put that the wrong way. If you found out you were dying, who would you call? What would you say? And why are you waiting? And so, the idea here is that these things are relevant all the time, and we can feed the information that we get back from the experience of patients into our discipline and apply it moving forward. I'll give it back to you.
You give it back to me. Great. So I have it back.
You want to talk about that?
No. That was our presentation on transdisciplinarity. We would like to start by asking you if you have questions or comments. And after that, we would like to come up with an example, like the suffering example, with the group, if you are so inclined. Yes.
Yes.
And you're looking at things like pheromones and defensive chemicals, stuff like that. So back in the 90s and in the 80s, it was very much an interdisciplinary thing. Chemists talking to ecologists, evolutionary biologists. Nowadays, nobody thinks of it as an interdisciplinary thing. It's a thing.
Yeah, well, I think, and I think this is what happens. And one of the things that's interesting is sort of our choice about this, right? So sometimes I think what happens is it becomes a thing, and it's a thing biologists do, and it's a thing that chemists do, and that's kind of it, right? And then the other thing that happens, and like in my field, one of the things that's happening is this cognitive neuroscience. So we got a bunch of sort of related disciplines coming together to create a new discipline that's cognitive neuroscience. And it really is trying very hard to set disciplinary boundaries and say, oh, no, we're not biology. Oh, no, we're not psychology. Oh, no, we're not computer science. We're cognitive neuroscience. And what I think transdisciplinarity ideally could allow us to do is to do that thing that cognitive neuroscience does without having to play the territoriality game as much. I don't know, what do you think?
Yes.
Well, I think it's possible. Again, and I'm just basing it on my own experiences, but nobody really looks at chemical ecology now as this odd hybrid. It's fully mature.
Is it its own discipline?
Yes, very much so. This whole journal team.
Okay.
And the idea
That's the definition.
a student goes into that, it's not so much like you're hanging out in this area and that area, although we do that anyway, but it does have its own boundaries, you might say.
Do people get, and I apologize for my ignorance about this, but do people get degrees in that as opposed to a degree in biology with an emphasis? Okay.
It's still true that you might find somebody who's a chemical ecologist in an entomology department or a botany department or an evolution department or something. So I guess in that way the process is still going. But nobody furrows their brows as, oh, what's that?
Right, yeah. So yeah, and I think that's great. That's to me that's like the most exciting thing that can happen out of this is that you say like, oh yeah, that's a way of approaching this set of problems. I know what that is. That's how you approach this set of problems. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm.
I'm just going to try to answer, and then you can say if I answered your question. I think I understood what you mean, and I think this is something that we don't often enough take into account when we think about curriculum. You know, we tend to write curriculum for the student we would like to have.
Right, yeah.
Or I think what I often do, I write the curriculum that the student I could never be would have liked to have. Like, oh my gosh, if they would have only let us do that, what I would have learned. You know, I hated lectures because the first lecturer I had in college started to the question why we have to learn historical linguistics. He told us that historical linguistics isn't good for anything, but it also doesn't hurt anybody. I never listened. I had to go to graduate school and get another historical linguistics course where I finally understand why this is unbelievably important, and how could I ever dare to read a 19th century novel without before having had historical linguistics. So, so what do I want? I want an instructor who does that, and I assume immediately that's what everybody needs. But to go back to your question, how do you involve the different learning styles? I actually think that this model can involve the different learning styles in their different ways more than a traditional model that is based on we present the information in the same way to everybody, by letting students work on a project and then having that wicked problem and letting the students make the decisions. What are the important requirements? What do we need to know? What do we need to research? And then they can follow their own passion and their own learning style in the way they research these things, and then can come back and exchange that with the others. What they do need is a lot of self-efficacy in this model, and that's, I think, one of the important things the institution and the professor has to facilitate. But I would hope that if one does this, that it actually means the students can be more themselves and go on their different pathways in their different ways, finding this information. So did I understand you right, and did I answer the question right? Yeah.
But in reality, all they're doing is getting computers in critical thinking areas. I just wanted to see how Transdisciplinary can take all this phenomenon of the university curriculum and integrate it and make it palatable.
Yeah, well, I think that what's kind of challenging about that is that it's going to be driven by the particular problem. So whatever problem would be of interest to that group of people, And it's very, I mean, my experience with this is generally that if you get a group of people together, they can identify something that they all have some interest in, even if they come at it from very different directions. And if you then let that problem drive how you're going to respond to it, it's like you'll be working with those people that with very different learning styles, with those students, and you'll be creating a new sort of synthetic discipline for that problem with them, right? So in a way, this approach is different from almost everything else we're going to do, right? It's not like we're not going to do all the other things we're going to do. We have to do all the other things we're going to do anyway. But the added part of this is, as Karen said, there's this self-efficacy here. There's this way in which the student's interest in a problem is driving it, right? Now, one thing that we've talked about a lot is, well, what kinds of problems are these, and how would we identify them? And this, I think, is where the faculty member can kind of, be instrumental. We all have different interests like this that we can pursue, and students will find them to be of interest too. So, for instance, I'm developing a course on processes of social change. Right? Now, I have to synthesize a bunch of different disciplines in order to have a course on processes of social change. And some students are going to look at that and find it interesting, Yeah. Well, I would say you're gonna have one problem that you all kind of agree on, and you're all gonna bring your own different set. Each student has their particular genius, and that student's gonna bring that to it. Our role in this case is to identify the problem, right? And then you can let people bring whatever they bring to it, but ideally we're going to be showing them that it's possible to synthesize methods from a variety of disciplines. Right. Now, here's the thing. So suppose you have somebody who's really like a visual learner and a visual communicator, right? Well, everybody's going to want to benefit from what that person can do. The graphs, the charts, the maps, the things that person can put together, of almost whatever problem it is that you're working on, would be potentially useful, right? Somebody, another person who's really more of a writer or communicator or speaker, there's going to be things that they can do. But I think the obligation here is just like that palliative care example that I gave you. There might be some people who have different sort of areas of expertise or different competencies, if you will, but everyone is expected to be an expert in the problem, right, in whatever problem it is. And that's what your students would be doing through the course. Right, so when I do this social change course, I'm going to try, to have everyone contribute in ways that are drawing from different disciplines and from their different learning abilities, but I'm interested in each one of them being capable of a certain level of expertise in social change and understanding social change. I don't know if that's helpful either, but yeah, all right. Sure. Right, you have to have both, and the idea with this transdisciplinarity course is that it's going to be the one place, it's going to be one place where you synthesize things. There's going to be other places, the rest of your degree, ideally, is going to be, of increasing specialization as you go, right? But this is one place, it's part of, think about it, it's sort of the last kind of stage of a general education program. So from a general education standpoint, it's, this rounded education, right? I mean, and so we're going to synthesize from the various disciplines that are available to us to do something practical to address a real world problem. I said real world.
He
I
did.
don't know, was that helpful?
I hope that was recorded. Lydia. I think that makes perfect sense. Do we have other questions, comments? Yes, Kikomo.
You look at the guide sheet, for example, the left side, that's where we have most of the general education. So should we say these are places where we need to have that and not the right side, or what would be the advice there?
Well, I think that in the way that we're talking about this now, I mean, theoretically you could have it anywhere, but from a practical standpoint, we're talking about having, an experience like this that's part of that left side of the guide sheet, that's part of the general education program. And so the other specialization that the person is going to do, ideally, will just be enhanced by this. It doesn't mean that they're not going to do all of the specialization that's required. I mean, certainly, we need that. We have to have people complete the, their degree programs with all of the, requirements that accrediting bodies typically stipulate, and that all has to happen. It's just that this could be a way of facilitating. I mean, in a sense, it's what general education is for. If you can do things like this, you're using your general education.
I think, yes, it's the element of synthesizing that Don has mentioned so often, and we all know from teaching and then from thinking back from our own learning, that synthesizing different strains is the most difficult thing to do very often. So if you model, the idea would be that, yes, in general education, and it already is because it's the first SLO in general education is transdisciplinarity, that every general education course is aware of this and talks about this and uses it, refers to other courses, refers to different disciplines, refers to the discipline the students study in their major, but that, and at the end you take this one class, that would be the idea if we do it with one class, where you model it once, and where you go through the process once in this class, and that sort of culminates your general education, but hopefully also influence, at this point it has to also grasp on your disciplinary education. So it doesn't mean you give up on the discipline, because as the image shows, you still need to be an expert. You need to be an expert in a specific form of, in this case, palliative care. You need to have a certain knowledge base in a specific discipline. This is not the interdisciplinarity of the 70s, where there were no more disciplines. This is the synthesis, and I'm going to try to say transdisciplinarity is the synthesis of the disciplines. I did it. That was awesome, wasn't it? Yeah.
Other
Yes.
questions?
Envision this, how are the team members communicating? Like, is it through game-wise, or is it meetings, or?
Oh, okay.
Oh, no, no, we are.
Yeah, that's a really good practical question. So there's some interesting ways to go about this. So one thing I would say is that in order to create, so it depends on the problem, but you don't necessarily need to have people specifically from other disciplines in the teaching of the course. The students can do this work, by engaging. They can go out and talk to people. You can bring in guests. There's a variety of different ways that you can do this. And the students can figure out their own way that they want to share information. I mean, we can help. I mean, we can use things like Blackboard and stuff like that. But there's a way that these kinds of courses could be sort of ideally team taught, and that's fantastic. I don't think they necessarily have to be team taught. Right? And if we do the team teaching, that gets, I think that's going to end up having to be a very highly collaborative relationship between the team, the team teachers. But part of the problem here is that in order for us to talk about how the course is going to work, it's like you need a problem. And a lot of the books that do this work will kind of keep tending to come back to many of the same problems. This one that I've shared with you is one. Another one that people often use is the phenomenon of environmental racism. So environmental racism, you may be familiar with this, that there are demographics that contribute to people of color living closer to environmental toxins and places where pollutants are we have higher exposure to pollutants, things like that. And in order to understand that problem, you have to sort of understand, you have to synthesize the science relative to toxins and pollutions and environmental hazards. You have to synthesize the geography and demographics, and you have to synthesize the sociology, social issues, and even some economics, right? There's a variety of different things that you have to pull in order to study that problem and address that problem. But it seems to me that, someone who has, a kind of expertise, in one of those involved disciplines could facilitate students doing that work without necessarily having to, okay, I have to take off my psychologist hat now and I have to bring in the geographer's hat, and or by the same token, I can't speak about this, I have to go get a geographer and let me bring him in and or her in and have her talk to you. Does that make sense? Yeah. 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 Other questions? I think that's good enough. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's all we have. We'll be out in the lobby if you have questions or you want to talk about this. Thank you, everybody, for coming on the last hour of the last day of professional development.
You did it, it's over.
Yay.